In previous videos, I have introduced the subject of the mind-body problem and have begun detailing and defending various arguments for the truth of substance dualism, the idea that the mind is an immaterial substance distinct from the physical body or brain. In this video, I want to consider an argument for dualism which has always stood out from the rest to me. This argument is the modal argument for dualism. The argument asks us to consider certain modal facts about ourselves which we could only possess if the mind is immaterial, and from this, it concludes that the mind must be immaterial. The structure of this video is as follows. First, I will give some illustrations to prime viewers' intuitions for the argument which is to follow. After this, I will formalize the modal argument for dualism into a deductive syllogism. As we shall see, the third premise will be the most controversial premise. I shall offer 4 lines of defense for this premise. After this, I shall consider and dispel a variety of objections to it. And lastly, I shall consider and reject more general objections to the modal argument. In 1999, the Wachowskis released a popular science fiction film entitled The Matrix. The plot is set far in the future and follows the story of a computer programmer known as Neo. Throughout the course of the story, Neo comes to discover that all of humanity is unknowingly trapped by machines inside of a simulated virtual reality called the Matrix. The entire world which Neo had thought that he had inhabited does not actually exist. The film takes advantage of a very interesting philosophical thought experiment which goes back most famously to the 17th century French philosopher René Descartes. Descartes imagined a scenario in which everything appeared as it does to him, and yet he was actually being deceived by an all-powerful malicious demon. More modern thought experiments of mad scientists deceiving brains in vats are similarly motivated by the idea that our senses might be deceived on a global scale. As Richard Swinburne says, Descartes' supposed principle about what is logically possible is that while he thinks and is aware of thinking, he can, compatibly with I am thinking, conceive that I have no body. For maybe Descartes just dreams that he has a body, so he claims that he can conceive, and so it is logically possible that I am thinking and I have no body. This premise certainly seems to those who first hear it immensely plausible. After all, in a dream, anyone can be mistaken about the nature and location of their body and the extent of their bodily powers. People often dream that they are flying. And no one can know infallibly that they are not dreaming. So surely, anyone can be mistaken about whether or not they have a body, and so reflecting on what is involved in his thinking, Descartes sees no incompatibility in I am thinking and I have no body. These sorts of thought experiments indicate that it is possible for our minds to exist even in the absence of anything physical existing. But if this is possible, then it follows that our minds cannot themselves be physical, and so the mind must be an immaterial sort of thing. The point of highlighting the possible truth of these skeptical scenarios is not, of course, to cast doubt on our everyday beliefs about the reality of a physical world. Rather, the point is that because possibilities are grounded in actualities, the possibility that our minds could exist apart from anything physical tells us something about the actual status of our minds. As David Lund says, though modal facts are facts about circumstances other than those of the actual world, such facts nevertheless depend on how things actually are. And Marleen Rozemond adds, Descartes' first move is to introduce skeptical arguments that are meant to undermine the assumption that there are sensible qualities in the physical world. These doubts are meant to force one to set aside one's beliefs. They generate a need for arguments in favor of any entities one would wish to posit. The possibility of our minds existing apart from anything material entails that they are immaterial. This is the basic idea undergirding modal arguments for dualism. Again, Lund explains, a subject agent seems to have modal properties that no physical particular can possess. In first-person terms, if it is metaphysically possible for me to exist as subject agent in the absence of all physical particulars or in isolation from them, but not possible for any physical particular to exist under such conditions, then, as subject agent, I am not a physical particular. Such an argument, if sound, would establish that I have, as subject agent, the metaphysical status not only of a particular, but also of a non-physical particular as well. W.D. Hart puts the basic argument succinctly, saying, neither your mind nor your body is more basic than the other. Either could exist even if the other did not. This view is, or is like a version of, Descartes' dualism. The best argument for this view is also due to Descartes. What you can imagine is possible, and you can imagine being disembodied, so you could be disembodied. What I have just expressed is a very casual way of presenting the modal argument for dualism, but now let's attempt to formalize the argument into a syllogism. In its most basic form, the argument looks like this. 1. My mind is essentially either material or immaterial. 2. If it is logically possible for my mind to exist apart from anything material, then my mind is not essentially material. 3. It is logically possible for my mind to exist apart from anything material. 4. Therefore, my mind is not essentially material. 5. Therefore, my mind is essentially immaterial. A critical term used throughout the argument is the term mind. At the outset, I should say something about how this term is being defined within the argument, since the nature of the mind is the matter of the present controversy. In order to avoid presupposing any particular account of the mind, and thereby begging the question against the physicalist, I will be using this term in the most minimal sense. By the term mind, I will simply mean that which possesses thoughts and undergoes experiences. I take it that whatever other characteristics one wishes to attribute to a mind, they will at least include these two things. It's also important to understand that the designation of this mind as my mind in the argument is intended to include not just the thing which has my thoughts and experiences, but also the very same thoughts and experiences which I actually have at this very moment. In other words, the argument is not intended to say that it is merely logically possible that there should be some hypothetical immaterial mind. Instead, it is intended to say that it is logically possible that my own mind, complete with all of its past and present thought properties, could, at this very moment, exist in the absence of all physical things. The form of this argument appears to be impeccable. It is logically valid. In other words, the conclusion follows necessarily if the premises are true. But then we must ask, are the premises true? Let's consider each one in turn. Premise 1 appears to be pretty safe since it expresses a true dichotomy. I suppose that one could try to suggest a third option, namely that the mind is not essentially one thing, but rather a combination of both material and immaterial substances. However, this move will entail substance dualism, and so will be of little hope to those trying to escape the conclusion of the argument. Furthermore, in a previous video, I have offered numerous arguments to the effect that the mind is an irreducibly basic particular, a singular and indivisible entity. If these arguments hold, then the mind cannot be a combination or composite in any sense, and therefore, premise 1 does indeed express a true dichotomy. Premise 2 is analytically true. If my mind were essentially material, as the physicalist believes, then it surely could not exist if nothing material existed. The non-existence of all material objects would straightforwardly preclude the existence of a physical mind. Premises 4 and 5 follow deductively from the 3 preceding premises, so the real point of contention is premise 3. It's important to realize that the third premise is merely expressing a logical possibility, so it could be the case that, in fact, minds causally depend upon bodies or brains. The premise just asserts a logical separability between the two. As Charles Taliaferro says, the premise does not assert that I ever have existed or will exist without my body, but simply that such separability is possible. A defender of the argument may believe that at no time have persons existed or will exist without their bodies. All the defender need claim is that it is possible that I can exist without this body, or vice versa. The person may be envisaged as surviving the extinction of his or her body, either in an altogether disembodied state or as re-embodied. If it is possible for me to have a different body switching as it were, then it follows that I am not identical with the body I have now. But here we arrive at the burning question, is it possible for my mind to exist in the absence of anything material existing? There are at least 4 distinct ways to support the truth of the third premise. These are 1. By appealing to the conceivability of one's disembodied existence, 2. By appealing to the conceivability of body-switching or the gradual disassembly of the body, 3. By appealing to other areas of discourse where the idea of disembodied existence is regarded as intelligible, and 4. By defending an indirect realist theory of perception. We shall examine each of these 4 lines of argument in turn. Regarding the first line of defense, the third premise certainly has a great deal of initial plausibility due to thought experiments which are seemingly possible where one thinks of themselves as existing in a disembodied state. After all, scenarios like deception in the Matrix, or by Descartes' evil demon, have not only struck most philosophers as logical possibilities, but as genuine challenges. As Kevin McCain puts it, our experiences aren't perfectly reliable, i.e., they sometimes lead us astray. Realization of this fact led Descartes to worry. If our experiences sometimes lead us astray, how can we tell when they are leading us astray and when they're not? It's not clear that we can. But if we can't tell in general whether our experiences are leading us astray or not, then it seems possible that they always do. If there is some logical contradiction entailed by the notion that our sensory impressions don't accurately relay a physical world to us, it is certainly not obvious what it might be. One would think that all of the creative efforts by epistemologists over the past few centuries, which have been employed to rebut external world skepticism, would have uncovered a contradiction by now, if there were one. As Charles Taliaferro says, conceiving of disembodiment is not like imagining there is a square circle, or that something could be made up entirely of wood and not made up of wood at the same time. Rather, it is something we may positively grasp and not just weakly conceive. David Lund is somewhat more detailed in his explanation, saying, "Let us begin our critical examination of the third premise by noting the prima facie conceivability of my existing with exactly my mental and phenomenal properties in isolation from all material things." We might consider how easy it seems to be to enter into the thought experiment of Descartes' Meditations, in which he speculates that, although he believes himself to be awake and immersed in a world of material things, he might be dreaming, or the victim of a hallucination induced by an evil genius. He would exist in either case, but the body he experiences would be phenomenal, not the physical body he believes he has. In first-person terms, my existing with only my mental and phenomenal properties in a world that, though appearing to me like the actual world, is in fact a phenomenal world, is prima facie conceivable for me. Indeed, it seems easy to form a comprehensive, explicit, and detailed conception of my continuing to have a variety of experiences, including sensory ones, in apparent independence of all material things. Thus, thought experiments of this sort, which have struck most to have reflected upon them as being logically possible, yield some initial support for the third premise of the modal argument. If disembodiment is not logically possible, then neither are these hypothetical skeptical scenarios. But because, upon reflection, they do appear to be possible, the third premise appears to be true. The second line of argument for the truth of the third premise can be found in a different sort of thought experiment, namely thought experiments involving a person switching from one body to another. Such body switching features prominently in works of science fiction and appears to be perfectly intelligible. There is nothing obviously contradictory about someone occupying and controlling a body which previously belonged to someone else. But, of course, this sort of switching between bodies is not possible if the mind is an essentially material thing. Perhaps the skeptic could suggest that what we are actually imagining in these scenarios is not a complete switching of bodies, but rather something more like a brain transplant. That is to say, perhaps what we are actually imagining is the physical basis of a person being transferred to another body, and so there are no implications regarding the immateriality of the mind from these sorts of thought experiments. However, just on its face, it seems clear that the skeptic is describing a different sort of scenario here than the one originally put forward. Moreover, both hypotheticals seem logically possible. That is to say, we can imagine someone switching bodies either by having a brain transplant or without having a brain transplant. The skeptic is merely putting forward a different thought experiment than the one originally suggested. And in any case, it is far from clear that one can easily identify a person with their brain in this way. After all, neurosurgeons are capable of removing most of the brain, and yet presumably they have not thereby removed most of the person. If 25% of your brain were removed during brain surgery, presumably you would not be merely 75% of a person at the end of it. The skeptic could try to respond that as long as some of the original brain remains, then that is all that is needed to sustain a person's identity. But this causes the skeptic to face a further difficulty pertaining to the possibility of a neurosurgeon's transplanting both halves of a person's brain into two different bodies. While the science here is currently still in its infancy, everything indicates that this could really be done. And if it could be done, then which of the resulting persons is the original person, given that both have equal parts of the original brain? Richard Swinburne makes this point well, saying, "The removal of either the left or the right cerebral hemisphere seems to have little effect on memory or character, from which it follows that each hemisphere contains some of the brain traces physically necessary and, given that the hemisphere is functioning normally, sufficient for having many of the same memories and desires." Now suppose that the left hemisphere of some person, Alexandra, is put into the skull of another person, Alex, whose left hemisphere has been removed and is connected to the rest of Alex's brain, and that Alexandra's right hemisphere is put into the skull of a different person, Sandra, whose right hemisphere has been removed and is connected to the rest of Sandra's brain. Then both the two resulting persons would have some of Alexandra's brain and should be expected to claim to remember quite a lot of Alexandra's actions and experiences. They could not, however, both be Alexandra, for if Alex is Alexandra and Sandra is also Alexandra, then Alex would be the same person as Sandra, but subsequently to the operation, their bodies and brains are formed of different matter, and they live different lives with different experiences, and so they could not both be Alexandra. So if the two cerebral hemispheres were taken out of the brain of Alexandra's skull, and one of these was put in the skull of Alex, from which the corresponding hemisphere had been removed, it would be logically possible that the resulting person is Alexandra, and also logically possible that the resulting person is not Alexandra. So if she is Alexandra, then there must be something about her which distinguishes her from the possible human who is not Alexandra. And if she is not Alexandra, there must be something about her which distinguishes her from Alexandra. And since they have all the same bodily, that is, physical parts, they must differ in the respect that one of them has a certain pure mental part, which the other lacks, which I will call their soul. The point is simply that people are not easily identifiable with any particular part of their body or brain, since any physical candidate for any given person can either be removed completely, with the person still existing, or else can be divided up among several people with no obvious and non-arbitrary candidate emerging who retains the identity of the person. Consequently, these sorts of thought experiments likewise support the notion that the mind is a separate entity from the body, which could possibly exist apart from anything physical. In order to better appreciate this point, some viewers may find it helpful to imagine themselves without various parts of their body and then gradually remove more of them. Along the way, consider if you would still exist as a thinking subject without that part of your body. W.D. Hart illustrates this exercise vividly. Suppose that one morning, still embodied, you awaken. Before raising your eyelids, you grope your way over to your mirror. Facing it, you raise your lids. You can see in the mirror that your eye sockets are empty, that your eyeballs are missing. The point is that you can visualize your face with empty eye sockets as it would look to you in the mirror. This is, of course, curious. So raising your hand, you probe an empty eye socket with one of your little fingers. You can visualize how that little finger probing the socket would look, and you can do for touch as visualizing is to sight, what that finger might feel like against the flesh of your empty eye socket. Growing more curious, you saw round the top of your head, peel back the top of your skull, and peer into your brain pan. It too is empty, and again, the point is that you can visualize how your empty brain pan would look to you in the mirror. But now we have a recipe for the visual experience you would have of yourself without eyes or a brain. These are most people's favored candidates for bodily organs essential to sight. You do not need hands, feet, or pancreas to see, so imagine them away. Indeed, for any one of your remaining organs, you can imagine visual experience of yourself without it. Moreover, you can visualize what you would see in the mirror even if all of the rest of your body were gone. To be sure, you see none of your body since that is gone now, but you see, from a certain point of view, the reflection in the mirror of the room behind you. So you have a recipe for visual experience of yourself disembodied. Alvin Plantinga makes a similar point, albeit somewhat more humorously. Let's think about it at the cellular level. It seems entirely possible that the cells of which my body is composed be rapidly, within a microsecond or two, replaced by other cells of the same kind, the original cells being instantly destroyed. It also seems entirely possible that this process of replacement take place while I remain conscious, thinking about dualism and marveling at some of the appalling arguments against it produced by certain materialists. The bottom line is that it is no easy task to identify persons with any particular physical part of them. The most promising candidate is the brain, and, as we have seen, that too leads to difficulties. These considerations support the truth of the third premise. If we cannot be identified with any particular physical item, then we are logically separable from any of them, and therefore we could exist apart from them. A third way of demonstrating the truth of the third premise is to point the skeptic to topics other than thought experiments or the modal argument, where disembodied existence seems possible. Viewers may recall that in my introductory video on the topic of the mind-body problem, I introduced a third alternative to physicalism and dualism, namely idealism, the idea that there is no mind-independent physical reality. While idealism is surely not a very popular theory in contemporary philosophy, virtually no one rejects it on the basis that it is logically impossible. The arguments against idealism treat it as at least being a coherent theory, which could possibly be true. But if that is the case, then it is at least possible that idealism is true. And if idealism is possibly true, then the third premise of the modal argument is also true. Charles Taliaferro makes this point rather well, saying, "You may find yourself in the same position as many philosophers who reject idealism as a false view of this life, and yet believe that it is only contingently, and therefore not necessarily, false. That is, idealism is not an incoherent philosophy, even if, as it happens, material objects exist, which are not themselves constituted by mental states and activities. If you think you could exist in an idealist universe, imagine that one day God made idealism correct, then you have reason to believe that you are not your material body, for no material object in this world, including your body, could exist under those conditions. Something would then be true of you, which would be false of all material objects in our physical world." A related point can be made concerning so-called out-of-body experiences. Such experiences are fairly commonly reported, and while all such reports may well be misinterpretations of what was actually happening, they do at least seem possible, which would support the truth of the third premise of the modal argument. As James Madden argues, some philosophers make much of near-death experiences as evidence for dualism. If consciousness continues even after the body, including the central nervous system, has succumbed to death, it would seem that the mind is a separate substance from the body and can exist on its own. My own view is that near-death experiences do not constitute much of a direct case in favor of substance dualism. Nevertheless, even if one denies, as I am inclined, that near-death experiences are literally cases of disembodied experience, the fact that they seem to be coherent as experiences might be enough to support premise 3. Notice that typical reasons for rejecting near-death experiences do not proceed from a presumption of the inconceivability of disembodied experience. When someone claims to have had a near-death experience, our reply is typically not to point out to him that he is obviously mistaken because such experiences are logically impossible or flatly inconceivable. Rather, we tend to reply by offering other explanatory hypotheses for how the experience may have come about. The point is that if disembodied existence were inconceivable, then we should reject claims to have had such experiences without bothering with any empirical investigation. Charles Taliaferro and Jill Evans make a similar point, saying, in fact, there is an impressive body of literature in which persons report out-of-body experiences when they are near death or have been pronounced dead and prior to resuscitation. Let's assume all such experiences are not accurate accounts of persons actually leaving their bodies. But even granting that the experiences are false or unreliable, don't they at least appear to describe a coherent bona fide possibility? If we have a reason to think a person can, even if she never does, survive the annihilation of her body, there is something true of her, but not true of her body. The fourth and final argument, which we will consider in support of the third premise, is also probably the most powerful. This move involves arguing for indirect realism, or the sense-datum theory of perception. In contemporary philosophy, direct realism, sometimes called naive realism, is the most popular theory of perception. Direct realism is the idea that our senses put us directly in contact with physical objects external to our minds. What we have in our perceptual field just is the physical objects which cause those perceptions. As Panayot Buchvarov explains, direct realism represents our common sense and phenomenologically firmly grounded view of sense perception, namely that at least seeing and tactual feeling are simply cases of being mentally confronted with, aware, conscious of, material objects. Direct realism contrasts with indirect realism. There are, of course, other theories of perception, but these two are, by far, the two most common. Indirect realism agrees with direct realism that there is a real world of mind-independent physical objects which cause our sensory impressions. But it disagrees with direct realism that we perceive the physical objects themselves. Rather, what we perceive is a wholly mental image or representation of those objects, in philosophical terminology, a sense datum, which is numerically distinct from the physical objects which cause the perception. There is an epistemic gap between what is perceived and what is there independently of the perception. In this way, perception is indirect, hence the name indirect realism. In what follows, I will take some space to make the case for indirect realism over against direct realism. Due to the already significant length of this video, I will attempt to make this section of the video no longer than it absolutely needs to be. But because this represents my primary defense of the most controversial premise of the modal argument for dualism, I must defend each point with some degree of thoroughness. Hence, after I present each line of argument for indirect realism, I will consider objections from Michael Huemer, who is, perhaps, the most popular and influential defender of direct realism today. Unfortunately, in order to keep this video of a manageable length, I simply cannot engage the literature surrounding the philosophy of perception more deeply than that. It would seem that in order to resist the third premise of the modal argument, that we could exist in the absence of anything physical, the skeptic would have to adopt direct realism as a theory of perception. After all, whatever knowledge we have of physical objects is presumably mediated by means of sensory perception. And if our sensory perceptions could possibly be exactly the same, even if there were no physical objects, then it will be possible for us to exist in the absence of anything physical, just as the third premise asserts. Unfortunately for the skeptic of the modal argument, direct realism faces insurmountable difficulties. For one, we know scientifically that there is a brief time lag between events in the external world and our ordinary perception of them, and this gap is increased by distance, which is why people on Earth can still see stars which ceased existing hundreds of years ago. But how can this be if we are supposed to be perceiving objects directly? As David Lund explains, the time lag between external event and subsequent perception brought about by it is sometimes very striking in the case of sound when what is heard can be compared with what's seen. Suppose that several hundred yards away from us, a man is pounding a post with a sledgehammer. We see the hammer strike the post, but do not hear the sound of the impact until the hammer is rising for another blow. Clearly, the event which led to the auditory experience no longer exists at the time the experience occurs. But then, it cannot be what is directly perceived unless we can either directly perceive what does not exist, or perception can somehow extend into the past. Michael Huemer, a defender of direct realism, has this to say in response to this argument. I see no reason why one should not be able to perceive something in the past. Obviously, the time at which your perceiving occurs cannot be before your experience occurs, but why must the time of the perceived state of affairs be identical with the time of the perceiving? But the answer to Huemer's question seems all too obvious. The past is different from the present with respect to its sequence. The past does not and cannot exist within the present, for that would be to destroy the sequential relation between past and present. One cannot directly perceive the past in the present for the simple reason that the past does not exist in the present. The past is not presently there in order to be perceived. To be sure, people can see a present representation of the past, but to accept this is just to accept the sense data theory of perception. As Lund observes, it is one thing to say that hallucinations and ghost sightings are cases of seeing what does not exist, and quite another to suggest, as a solution to the time lag problem, the view that in ordinary visual perception, what is seen is a physical object, state, or event which does not exist at the time it is seen. Since all perception involves physiological process and consequently time lag, this suggestion leads to the paradoxical conclusion that perception is always a matter of perceiving what no longer exists, that what is directly experienced in perception has no ontological status at the time it is experienced. This is hardly an improvement over indirect realism. We do much less violence to our fundamental conceptual framework by maintaining that we directly experience a present effect of what no longer exists. Consider also cases of double vision. This phenomenon can occur when one drinks alcohol or suffers head trauma, which results in a concussion. Less dramatically, you can experience double vision for yourself by taking something like a pen and looking straight ahead as you bring the pen right in front of your nose. At a certain point, the pen appears to split into two pens once it comes very close to your face. But surely the pen itself, as a physical object, has not divided in this way. Hence, what we are perceiving in the case of double vision cannot be the physical object itself. Again, Lund argues, consider a case of seeing double. I move a pen toward my eyes until it appears double. It is tempting to describe what I see as two images, but the direct realist would claim that it is one pen looking double. Though the pen cannot be double, it can look double. But is this satisfactory? Two colored expanses appear. Are both to be identified with the surface of the pen? If only one, then which one? And what is the ontological status of the other if there are no non-physical individuals? Huemer responds to this argument by saying, the correct description of the case is this. There is a single physical object that you are seeing. However, that object seems to be in two places. That is, your visual experience incorrectly represents the pen in two different places. This is a case of a visual illusion. This does not require us to say that there actually is anything that is in two places, nor that there are two things in two different places. Now, I agree with Huemer's description of what is objectively going on in cases of double vision, but I think he underdescribes it. We do not merely seem to see an object which appears to be in two different places, we actually have two different visual images before us. If that's not what's happening, then why does the experience merit the label of double vision? If humor tries to respond by saying that we merely appear to have two visual images, he owes us an account of the difference between a visual image and the appearance of a visual image. What is an appearance if not just another term for a visual image? For my part, it is simplest to say that there is nothing more to the appearance of a visual image than a visual image. A visual image just is an appearance. Lund agrees, arguing, the obvious problem with this view is that, unlike indirect realism, it cannot provide a unified account of sensory experience. According to indirect realism, the immediate object of a visual perception is, in every case, a visual sensation or image. But this version of the theory of appearing needs these in addition to appearing. The appearings cannot be reducible to sensations and images, for then the theory would collapse into indirect realism. But if they are not reducible, then it would seem that they constitute another fundamental ontological type, in which case the theory would compare unfavorably with indirect realism in regard to simplicity. Moreover, there are cases of sensory experience with respect to which this theory, because of its lack of unity, yields very different accounts of the immediate objects of perception, even though the objects are indistinguishable from the subject's point of view. The most difficult problem for the theory of appearing lies in understanding how an appearing can be a direct perception of a physical object if the object appears to be other than it is, and if the appearing is, as it obviously is, a function of the conditions of observation as well as of the nature of the object itself. A defender of the theory of appearing, like almost everyone else, makes an appearance-reality distinction and conceives of a physical object as something in itself, independently of its appearing to us. Consequently, it can appear to be other than it is. But if something does appear other than it is, how can we be directly perceiving it rather than something else? And E.J. Lowe makes a further point, according to which the very language of appearance belies the indirect nature of these sorts of perceptions. As he says, we may reinforce this conclusion by the following consideration. When is it, quite generally, that we speak of things appearing, in the epistemic sense, to be in places in which they are not? Is it not precisely when we perceive them indirectly by perceiving other things that actually occupy the places in question? For instance, a man may appear to be standing directly ahead of me because that is where a mirror image of him is actually located. If I don't know that the mirror image is only a mirror image, I might well be led to believe that the man is standing directly ahead of me. What I do see tends to support this belief. But why shouldn't we analyze the double vision case in much the same way, as involving two differently situated objects, both of which are seen by me, but neither of which is the pen? How else, indeed, can we analyze it? The most common and the most powerful argument against direct realism is based upon the well-known fallibility of sensory perception. The reality of phenomenon like illusions, hallucinations, and vivid dreams cast doubt upon the idea that we are directly aware of physical objects. These sorts of experiences uncontroversially establish that our senses can be misled in at least some instances. They are fallible. They do not provide us a direct window to the external world in every instance. But if that is the case, there doesn't appear to be any non-question begging way to avoid the conclusion that our senses might always be deceived. And if they can always be deceived, something like a Cartesian demon scenario is logically possible. We really could exist in the absence of anything physical existing. We turn first to the phenomenon of illusions. The most famous example here involves a straight stick or pencil which is placed into a glass of water and, although remaining straight, appears to be bent. Another example would be the Hermann grid illusion, where spectral gray or black spots appear at the intersections of a white grid on a black background. The spots disappear when looked at directly, yet they reappear when attention is shifted to the black background. This challenges direct realism because, in cases like these, the objects we are perceiving appear to have characteristics which the objects actually lack. But that can't be the case if we perceive objects directly as they really are. The mind has added something to the object of perception in such cases. As Derek Brown argues, the fact that there is nothing in the objective stimulus that can help explain the illusory experience is important because it means that the bulk of our explanation should be subjective. One's mind is doing something peculiar. It is adding something to the experience that is in no way part of, suggested by, or even consistent with the stimulus itself. The curious thing is that one's mind is not merely adding something to the experience, it is adding features to the object of the perception. The existential import of such descriptions often make intentionalists cringe, but they are not the indirect realist construction. This is the phenomenon that needs explanation, that from one's perspective, one is experiencing an instantiated set of features, no member of which match up with anything in the objective stimulus. And the most reasonable starting place is to accept that these are instantiated perceived features that are subjective but projected, to accept the orientation afforded by sense-datum theory. Indeed, the whole reason illusions are of interest is because they give evidence of our mind's capacity to add features that have no trace in the objective objects of perception. But the mind's creative capacities are not limited to merely adding things to veridical experiences, as in cases of illusion. The mind is also capable of generating entire experiences which are completely unlike one's physical environment, as in cases of hallucination or in dreams. Hallucinations provide even greater difficulty for direct realism than illusions, since illusions merely involve perceptual modifications of what is actually there, whereas hallucinations create a completely misleading, purely mental reality. They don't even involve a veridically perceived physical basis, as in an illusion. Some direct realists try to evade this sort of conclusion by insisting that phenomena like dreams and hallucinations are qualitatively different than cases of veridical perception. Dreams and hallucinations don't feel quite the same as veridical experiences. As R.J. Hurst says, naive realism can escape, however, by denying that having an hallucination is perceiving or perceptual consciousness. Despite subjective similarity, the mode and objects of consciousness in hallucination differ in kind from those in genuine perception. Now, it is debatable if this is really the case. If these sorts of experiences really are so manifestly different from veridical perceptions, one wonders why people are so often convinced that these experiences are perceptions of the real world. But this debate is really beside the point, for, as Richard Fumerton observes, the real point is that dreams and hallucinations could conceivably be indistinguishable from veridical experiences, even if they never actually are. As he explains, I am told that hallucinations can acquire extraordinary vivacity and complexity, but I certainly do not know whether hallucinatory experiences ever become quite as qualitatively rich as the day-to-day experiences we take to be veridical. Certainly in retrospect, it seems to me that my dream experiences were never as rich as the experiences I take to be veridical, but that could be as much a function of my being an unimaginative dreamer as anything else. In any event, even if it were true that no one has had vivid hallucinatory experiences, it would not affect the force of the argument from the possibility of hallucination, for that argument rests only on the possibility, the conceivability, of vivid, complex hallucinatory experiences. It is for this reason that the truth or falsity of naive realism is not a contingent question. If naive realism is an incorrect account of our relation to physical objects through sensation, it is a necessarily incorrect account. If false, naive realism is necessarily false. So having clarified what exactly the argument from hallucinations is asserting, let's present a formalization of it. Howard Robinson formalizes the argument as follows. 1. It is theoretically possible, by activating some brain process which is involved in a particular type of perception, to cause an hallucination which exactly resembles that perception in its subjective character. 2. It is necessary to give the same account of both hallucinating and perceptual experience when they have the same neural cause. Thus, it is not, for example, plausible to say that the hallucinatory experience involves a mental image or sense datum, but that the perception does not, if the two have the same proximate, that is, neural, cause. These two propositions together entail that perceptual processes in the brain produce some object of awareness which cannot be identified with any feature of the external world. That is, they produce a sense datum. There seems to be a reasonable amount of empirical evidence for one, and it also explains why veridical-seeming hallucinations should occur. If it were not for the fact that perceptual processes, however stimulated, were sufficient to generate experience, it would be a mystery why such hallucinations should occur. The direct realist will typically try to respond to arguments from hallucinations by appealing to the principle that qualitative similarity does not imply ontological similarity. In other words, although a vivid hallucination may be indistinguishable from a veridical experience, it does not follow that the two experiences are ontologically the same. One can involve a sense datum, while the other involves a direct apprehension of a physical object. Though this move may work to circumvent some versions of the argument from hallucinations, Robinson's version is carefully crafted to remove this option from the direct realist, as he explains. The principle that qualitative similarity does not entail ontological similarity is accepted by most sense datum theorists, for representative realists assert that data and physical objects share some properties. It might also be true that we ought to give a different account of hallucinations as they in fact occur than we give of perception. But those who suggest that such hallucinations need separate treatment presumably do so because they believe that normal hallucinations are very different from perceptions in their immediate causes. That is, that they involve the activation of different brain mechanisms. But in the present argument, just the same brain state, as is the immediate cause of the perception, is the immediate antecedent of the corresponding hallucination. If the mechanism or brain state is a sufficient causal condition for the production of an image or otherwise characterized subjective sense content when the physical objects are not there, why is it not so sufficient when they are present? Does the brain state mysteriously know how it is being produced? Does it, by some extra sense, discern whether the table is really there or not and act accordingly? Or does the physical object, when present, inhibit the production of an image by some sort of action at a distance? That such ad hoc hypotheses are implausible is the rationale of two. Surely difference of ontological status cannot plausibly be attributed to the sense contents in question if they are the upshot of the same proximate causes. Humer objects to arguments like Robinson's by simply denying that hallucinations involve perception at all. He says, "Fortunately, we do not need to accept the first stage of the argument. We do not need to accept that hallucinating is being aware of a mental image, nor do we have to find some physical phenomenon that one is aware of. For hallucination is not awareness at all. It is, so to speak, pseudo-awareness. That is, a mental state that seems like awareness of something, and in terms of its intrinsic properties, is just like perceptual awareness, but is not, in fact, the awareness of anything, for awareness is a relation between the subject and the world, and the hallucination fails to have the right relational properties." But surely the idea that one is not actually aware of anything in a hallucination is implausible. For if that were the case, what would differentiate a hallucination from a state of being unaware of absolutely anything at all, as in a dreamless sleep? If hallucinations do not involve awareness, as Humer claims, then it follows that in a hallucinatory experience, one is not actually aware of anything. If there are no sense data, then, in a hallucination, there is just nothing to be aware of. But this is so obviously wrong. There clearly is a difference between a hallucination and a dreamless sleep. Hence it seems better to distinguish, as philosophers traditionally have, between veridical awareness or perception and non-veridical awareness or perception, where the former involves awareness of something which either exists or at least represents something which exists outside of one's mind, and the latter does not. Now perhaps Humer doesn't mean anything as radical as that there is no difference between a hallucination and awareness of literally nothing as in dreamless sleep, and perhaps he is just stipulating a definition of awareness or perception which requires that they make reference to a relation between someone and the physical world. Humer is free to stipulate whatever definitions he likes, but I do think that the contrast between hallucinations and dreamless sleep serves as a defeater for the adequacy of his definition. Furthermore, the only reason for accepting this definition of perception or awareness seems to be a motivation to reject the sense-datum theory of perception. In any case, this really does nothing to address the argument. Humer tries to draw a distinction between awareness and pseudo-awareness, where awareness involves a genuine relation between a subject and the physical world, and pseudo-awareness involves merely seeming to be in that relation to the physical world. But whether we call it awareness or not, Humer has not explained why whatever relation a subject bears to that seeming state should not be considered a mental image or a sense datum. Presumably when someone has a hallucination, they stand in some sort of relation to that hallucination, otherwise there would be nothing to designate it as being their hallucination as opposed to anyone else's. And given the sort of experience a hallucination is, the label mental image seems wholly appropriate. The word mental highlights the fact that these experiences are restricted to the mind. The word image highlights the representational character of the content of these experiences. Were hallucinations not representational in nature, then they could not be hallucinations of things. But clearly hallucinations do represent things, and so identifying hallucinations as mental images seems quite right. Certainly Humer has utterly failed to give us any reason to think otherwise. The only reason for denying that hallucinations consist in mental images appears to be a question-begging assumption that the sense-datum theory of perception is false. If the sense-datum theorists are right, what exactly would awareness of a mental image be like, if not exactly what Humer has classified as pseudo-awareness? It is simply not enough to stipulate that hallucinations are not perceptions by definition. Hallucinatory experiences need to be adequately distinguished from the sorts of entities that sense-datum theorists are positing. I submit that Humer has not accomplished this task. Until direct realists do this, Robinson's argument from hallucinations against direct realism stands. We have been focusing on the metaphysics of hallucinations, but the argument can be made from the epistemology of hallucinations as well. Richard Fumerton, for example, presents the argument from Hallucinations slightly differently than Robinson. Whereas Robinson focused on the proximate cause of the hallucination being the same as in a veridical experience, Fumerton instead focuses on the justificatory status of the resulting belief. He formulates his argument as follows. 1. Any sensation or sequence of sensations S I have is such that it is possible that I have hallucinatory experience so rich as to be phenomenologically indistinguishable from S. 2. My justification, if any, for believing some proposition P about the physical world as a result of my having S is the same as the justification I would have had were S a hallucinatory experience. 3. If S were a hallucinatory experience, my justification for believing P would not consist in my being directly acquainted with the fact that P, since, by hypothesis, the fact that P would not exist. It follows that 4. My justification for believing P, whether S is hallucinatory or not, is not my being directly acquainted with the fact that P. Michael Huemer responds to Fumerton's argument by granting the conclusion, but by insisting that direct realism can still be true. He says, I agree with Fumerton's argument, except that I don't think it refutes direct realism. It is an argument against a form of direct realism, but it is not an argument against my version of direct realism, because I do not say that our justification for believing in external objects consists in our being directly acquainted with them. I say that our justification for believing in external objects consists in the fact that, when we have perceptual experiences, external objects seem to us to be present, and there is no evidence in general against this. However, as I have argued in my video on the moral argument, seemings are not a sufficient source of epistemic justification precisely because they are fallible. When it seems to one that there is a physical object before them, there are two possibilities. Either that seeming is indicating a truth, or it is indicating a falsehood. To prefer the former possibility, in the absence of a reason for doing so, is simply to make an arbitrary assumption. As John DePoe observes, the direct realist approach is untenable, since there is no way to distinguish between veridical experience and non-veridical ones, like hallucinations, dreams, and illusions. After all, it is possible for a person to have the exact same experiences of feeding ducks at the pond, whether the person is truly feeding ducks at the pond, the person is having a vivid and realistic dream of feeding ducks at the pond, or the person is having a vivid and realistic hallucination of feeding ducks at the pond. Since these experiences are indistinguishable, why assume the first is correct without some further reason? In direct realism, the position that relies upon inference from beliefs based upon sense experiences to arrive at contingent beliefs about the physical world provides a non-question-begging way to justify perceptual beliefs. The only way to terminate the looming epistemic regress of giving reasons to adjudicate between two possibilities is by reference to a belief which is epistemically certain. But our beliefs about the external world are simply not epistemically certain, precisely because it is always possible to think of situations in which we could possess the exact same evidence for our external world beliefs, and yet have those beliefs turn out to be false. Because the acquaintance theory of justification limits our certain empirical knowledge to our immediate sensory impressions, it is able to guarantee truth, and, consequently, it does not succumb to this problem in the way that Huemer's theory does. Fumerton correctly concludes, perceptual beliefs about the physical world are based on sensation or experience in a way that precludes the possibility of knowing with absolute certainty propositions about physical objects. To know P with absolute certainty is to have justification that precludes the possibility of error. The argument from the possibility of hallucination should convince us that no sensation or sequence of sensations can preclude the possibility that those sensations are hallucinatory. In order for direct realism to be a viable theory of perception, I think that direct realists will need to show that a full-scale systematic deception of our senses is logically impossible. They will need to show indirect realism to be logically contradictory in some way. And as long as it remains possible that our senses are being systematically deceived, the possibility that nothing physical exists will remain. Some skeptics of the modal argument apparently feel that the theory of evolution somehow entitles them to reject the perceptual justifications we have been considering in support of the third premise. This is because evolution suggests that our abilities to perceive were shaped by the physical world, and since the physical world is responsible for our ability to perceive, we may safely ignore the threats posed by Cartesian external world skepticism. Paul Churchland expresses such sentiments, saying, "The view that the mind knows itself first, in a unique way and far better than it can ever know the external world, has dominated Western thought for over 3 centuries. But if one adopts a thoroughly naturalistic and evolutionary perspective on the mind, the traditional view quickly acquires a sort of fairy tale quality. After all, brains were selected for because brains conferred a reproductive advantage on the individuals that possessed them, and they conferred that advantage because they allowed the individuals to anticipate their environment, to distinguish food from non-food, predators from non-predators, safety from peril, and mates from non-mates. In sum, a brain gave them knowledge and control of the external world. Brains have been the beneficiaries of natural selection precisely because of that feature. Evidently, what they know first and best is not themselves, but the environment in which they have to survive." Churchland's remarks here come off as naive, to say the least. In the first place, his dismissive attitude towards the idea that we know our own minds more immediately than the physical world because of supposed advances in science ignores the fact that scientific advances presuppose that we can know our own minds directly. As Richard Fumerton points out, a great many philosophers today give their unswerving loyalty to a naturalistic worldview. Part of that worldview carries with it the presumption that we should let science settle fundamental metaphysical controversies concerning what kinds of things exist. We can engage in endless empirical study of the activity in the brain, scanning that activity in all sorts of exotic ways, all without ever discovering what fundamentally interests us. Insofar as we are interested in understanding mental states, we are going to need to correlate the empirically observed neural activity with a less exotic but absolutely indispensable source of information about the mind. In short, we will inevitably rely on the first-person reports of people concerning their mental life in trying to correlate observed neural activity with the relevant mental state. One moral to draw from the above platitudes is obvious. Don't pay the slightest bit of attention to philosophers who talk about ideal theories and methods of cognitive science replacing our inadequate folk psychology, replete with its emphasis on the privileged epistemic position we occupy from the first-person perspective. The scientific discoveries that particularly interest us presuppose that we have a way of identifying mental states that is independent of, and at least as reliable as, the ways we have of studying changes that take place in the brain. But more fundamentally, Churchland's proposal is going to land him in epistemic skepticism. Of course, he may be right that natural selection has, in fact, shaped our perceptual faculties, but this does nothing at all to respond to the skeptical concern that it is epistemically possible that they did not, and that we are instead living in the matrix, or as victims of Descartes' demon. If Churchland intends for this to function as a justification for believing in a physical world, then it is just patently question-begging on Churchland's part. As Lawrence Bonjour responds, a second sort of defense of the general presumption in favor of materialism appeals to the general idea of naturalism. Here again we have a view, like materialism itself, to which many philosophers pay allegiance, while offering little by way of a clear argument or defense. Naturalism, for some of those who use the term, seems to just amount to materialism, which would make an argument from naturalism to materialism entirely question-begging. One cannot make use of the theory of evolution to justify their belief in an external world until they have already justified the proposition that there is an external world, inasmuch as the theory of evolution already assumes the existence of the external world. I am suggesting that without the sense-datum theory of perception, which I have already defended, one has no grounds for believing in an external world, and therefore no grounds for believing in the theory of evolution, or indeed for any other scientific theory. One must first have justified beliefs about sense data in order to validly infer the existence of a physical world. Otherwise, they are simply taking this proposition for granted. But since this mentalistic world of sense data is precisely what Churchland wants to deny, this avenue of justifying his belief in a physical world is not open to him. So he must find some other way to justify his belief in an external world. The appeal to evolution won't work. Scientific realism presupposes the existence of the physical world. Hence, to try to use the findings of science to support the existence of the physical world, as Churchland does, is simply an exercise in viciously circular reasoning. Timothy and Lydia McGrew argue, if epistemic internalism is indeed incompatible with metaphysical naturalism, and if there are reasons to accept internalism, this provides a reason to rethink naturalism. After all, the naturalist assumes that our faculties are reliable because they arose by way of the pressures of natural selection. This claim is itself an empirical one, intended to explain how our faculties came to be reliable and why we should trust them. But the attempt to ascend to the level of epistemology and defend that claim as justified bogs down, given an externalist reliability requirement, in the further empirical question of whether the belief-forming mechanisms used in that investigation are properly externally connected to truth. Why should an externalist be concerned about the entire argument of this section or troubled by epistemic circularity? Because if he does not do something about that argument, he will be unable to give a fully principled answer to the question of why he accepts principles about, say, sense perception as justificatory, but rejects those he finds repugnant. If a given externalist cannot find any problem in this scenario, he can go on his way undisturbed. But not everyone, not even every self-identified naturalist or externalist, will be able to shake the feeling that, in accepting arbitrariness at the level of epistemic principles, he has lost something valuable. To put this final point as forcefully as possible, we may ask the critic of the modal argument who wishes to maintain that there is some contradiction within a Cartesian demon scenario, what exactly that contradiction might be. And if he cannot produce a logical contradiction, then he is simply begging the question against the external world skeptic. Surely it is not admissible to simply presume that there is a contradiction within a position which one does not accept, without having to actually produce that contradiction. For if this is to be allowed, then one can dismiss whatever position one likes on the basis of it containing a contradiction which one is neither obligated to discover or produce. Perhaps the more cautious skeptic of the argument will not claim that there is in fact a contradiction entailed within this scenario, but that we simply cannot say one way or the other. That is to say, we must simply withhold judgment on the matter as to whether or not such scenarios are possible. A scenario is logically possible if a full description of it does not entail any logical contradiction. But how can we know that the thought experiments which are used to support premise 3 of the modal argument are not contradictory? This brings us to the central question of modal epistemology. How is it that we can know what is possible? I have presented 4 different lines of argument for the third premise of the modal argument. All of them have, to one degree or another, implicitly relied upon the principle that conceivability is a good guide to possibility. We know that something is logically possible if we are able to conceive of it. But this principle is by no means uncontroversial. Critics of the modal argument have assaulted this principle with a battery of criticisms and counterexamples, all of which are intended to show that we cannot unproblematically assume that whatever is conceivable is also possible. It is to answering these objections to the principle that we now turn. The skeptic of the modal argument who wishes to challenge it by challenging the possibility premise can do so in broadly 2 different ways. He can either deny modal realism, the notion that there really are such things as possibilities. Alternatively, he can agree that genuine possibilities do really exist, but adopt a skeptical stance towards conceivability as a guide to possibility. We might refer to these options as modal anti-realism and modal skepticism, respectively. We shall consider both options in turn. Perhaps the most straightforward way out of the modal argument for dualism is to simply deny modal realism. Modal realism, in this sense, is the thesis that there really are such things as possibilities. Importantly, I am not here using the term modal realism in the way that philosophers like David Lewis have to mean that all possible worlds actually exist. I am instead using the term in a more minimal sense to merely mean that non-actual possibilities are real things. The modal argument crucially depends upon modal realism, since it takes the possibility that I can exist in a disembodied state as a premise. But if nothing is possible, then surely this state of affairs is not possible. Hence, modal anti-realism might appear to afford the skeptic a simple way around the modal argument for dualism. But modal anti-realism is an extremely unpopular position, and for good reason. There are no less than 3 serious objections to modal anti-realism, which make this a most unpromising route for the skeptic of the modal argument. First of all, modal anti-realism can hardly be said to have any initial plausibility. It seems that everyday human activity operates upon the assumption that possibilities are both genuine and knowable. For example, it is my belief that there is a real possibility that I could be run over by a car that motivates me to look both ways before crossing the street. It is my belief that there is a real possibility that I could lose my job that motivates me to be at work on time. Examples could be multiplied, but the major point is just that, from a purely pragmatic point of view, modal anti-realism appears to be unsustainable and unlivable. We have to act as though possibilities are real. As David Lund says, we commonsensically assume that a good deal of what is actually occurring at any moment might have turned out differently. For example, that though I am not grocery shopping now, I might have been. This belief has great practical utility, as it is central to planning for the future. Thoughtful planning consists largely in trying to identify and then actualize certain possibilities, and to prevent the actualization of others. Our everyday efforts to direct our lives in a reflexive, considered manner, trying to survey the range of unactualized possibilities for future actuality, would be totally misguided if there were no such possibilities. Second, modal anti-realism has more far-reaching consequences than merely making nonsense of our everyday reasoning. It also creates problems for our philosophical reasoning as well. It makes thought experiments and consideration of counterfactual situations more generally utterly impossible. Again, Lund explains, the roots of modality extend deeply into our sophisticated philosophical thought about the world. Many of the fundamental issues in philosophy turn on what is or is not a non-actual possibility. The role of non-actual possibility in our views about personal responsibility is evident. When we make the moral judgment that some person ought to have acted other than he did, we assume that he could have acted differently. That is, that he failed to actualize a possible course of action that he could have actualized. But the modality eliminationism we are now considering would have us believe that alternative actions are not even metaphysically possible. The problems for modality eliminationism certainly do not end here, however. One would have to give up the belief that concrete particulars, all persons and material objects, exist only contingently rather than as a matter of necessity, for necessity and contingency, of course, have modal implications. Yet the belief that one's non-existence now, though not actual, was metaphysically possible seems unshakable. We would have to wonder how compelling a philosophical theory of modality would have to be to render credible the rejection of such a belief. Not surprisingly, no one has laid out the theoretical basis of a credible form of modality eliminationism, let alone a compelling one. Third and most damaging of all, modal anti-realism appears to be self-defeating. To understand why, we must reflect on the relationship between truth and belief. By almost all accounts, truth is the aim of belief. The idea is that truth is independent of belief. Merely having a belief is not sufficient to make the belief true. And when we engage in intellectual inquiry, we are attempting to get our beliefs to align with what is true. It has to be possible for our beliefs to be true or false. As W.D. Hart says, for truth to be objective, it must be possible that the world be otherwise than we think it to be. But, of course, if possibilities are not real, then it is not possible for our beliefs to be true. And if that is the case, then it follows that it is not possible for the modal anti-realist belief that there are no possibilities to be true either. And so his position ends up defeating itself. As Lund explains, the modality eliminationist must also be prepared to give up what one would have thought is absolutely fundamental, the objectivity of truth. The possibility of our being unaware of, or having mistaken beliefs about, what is objectively true, is inseparable from the very idea of objective truth. Such a possibility must be acknowledged for truth to be independent of our knowledge and belief. But, of course, the collapse of objective truth takes a great deal down with it. Thus, even if the denial of the objectivity of truth were the only wildly implausible consequence the modality eliminationist had to embrace, modality eliminationism would still be intolerable. Consequently, I conclude that denying the reality of possibilities is not a viable way to circumvent the modal argument for dualism, and it is a small wonder that this remains among the least popular objections to the modal argument for dualism. While modal anti-realism is not favored as a means of evading the conclusion, modal skepticism is much more pervasive. The difference here is that whereas modal anti-realism challenges the very existence of possibilities, modal skepticism merely challenges our ability to know what is possible, or at the very least, it challenges our ability to know what is possible along the lines offered by the proponent of the modal argument. Such skepticism is rarely thoroughgoing, that is to say, those who take a skeptical attitude towards modal knowledge when faced with the modal argument for dualism are not questioning our ability to have any modal knowledge. Rather, they are skeptical of our modal knowledge when it comes to the bigger questions of life, such as if we possess an immaterial soul. Peter van Inwagen explains, My own view is that we often do know modal propositions, ones that are of use to us in everyday life, and in science, and even in philosophy, but do not and cannot know, at least by the exercise of our own unaided powers, modal propositions like the crucial modal premises of possibility arguments. I have called this position modal skepticism. There is, of course, an initial difficulty for this sort of modal skepticism, namely that it appears to be objectionably selective. In other words, there seems to be no principled reason to accept that we have modal knowledge in everyday cases, but then deny that we likewise have modal knowledge when it comes to the bigger questions of life, such as the existence of the soul. It looks very much like this sort of skepticism is only being deployed when it is convenient for evading an undesirable conclusion, but clearly that's not acceptable. One cannot unproblematically help themselves to double handfuls of modal knowledge when they please, but then become extremely skeptical when modal propositions begin to indicate unpleasant conclusions. Some reason must be given to motivate the idea that our modal knowledge is restricted to just those instances where modal knowledge connects to everyday life. It is rather revealing that when Van Inwagen himself addresses this seeming inconsistency, he can find no principled reason to restrict our modal knowledge in this way. He says, "Although I do not doubt that we have some modal knowledge, I regard much of this knowledge as mysterious. Some modal statements, I have said, we know by reasoning from what I have called basic modal knowledge, simple, obvious modal statements whose truth we are somehow in a position to know, together with some facts about how the world is constructed. But how do we get started in this reasoning? How do we know the simple, obvious modal statements to be true? What is the ground of basic modal knowledge? I do not know how to answer these questions." If this is truly the best the modal skeptic can do, then the arbitrariness objection stands. There is not, in fact, any reason to restrict our modal knowledge to everyday affairs. But with all that being said, this merely serves to show that restricted modal skepticism is not a viable path. What if the skeptic of our modal argument chooses to bite the bullet and denies that we have any modal knowledge whatsoever? What can the defender of the modal argument say in response to this absolute form of modal skepticism? Defenders of modal arguments for dualism have traditionally appealed to conceivability to justify the idea that one's disembodied existence is indeed possible. In other words, we are able to conceive of ourselves as existing in a matrix-like scenario, or as the incorporeal victims of a Cartesian demon. Rarely is this fact challenged by skeptics. Instead, critics of the modal argument tend to object to the idea that our being able to conceive of existing in a disembodied state yields justification for believing that this is genuinely possible. In other words, they question the principle that conceivability is a reliable guide to possibility. For example, James Madden says, "The general connection between conceivability and logical possibility is equally contentious. It's not that there is any overwhelmingly good reason to doubt that conceivability is sufficient for logical possibility, but there isn't any overwhelmingly good reason to accept this claim either." Similarly, Thomas Nagel expresses some skepticism about conceivability as a guide to possibility, saying, "The migration of the self from one body to another seems conceivable, even if it is not in fact possible. What I imagine may be possible so far as what I know about my nature is concerned, but may not be possible as far as my actual nature is concerned. In that case, I will not have imagined myself surviving the death of my brain, but will merely have confused epistemic with metaphysical possibility." Elsewhere, Nagel seems inconsistent on this point. In another context, we find him saying, "Unless it has been shown positively that there cannot be such things, that the idea involves some kind of contradiction, we are entitled to assume that it makes sense, even if we can say nothing more about the members of the class." So in some cases, Nagel seems willing to allow us to affirm that something is possible until a contradiction has been demonstrated. But for some reason, he doesn't apply this same principle when it comes to the possibility of existing in a disembodied state. Obviously, this inconsistency on Nagel's part doesn't prove that conceivability is in fact a good guide to possibility, but it does highlight a tension present in the thought of many critics of the modal argument for dualism. They are happy to allow themselves unproblematic access to modal knowledge in other contexts, but suddenly adopt a very skeptical attitude when it comes to the modal argument for dualism. Possibility comes cheap, as the saying goes. Yet all of a sudden, possibility becomes quite expensive when it starts supporting conclusions which contradict physicalism. Physicalists typically readily admit that it surely seems possible that we could exist in a disembodied state, but they are simply unwilling to let that belief achieve a justified status when faced with the modal argument. For example, Colin McGinn writes, "The reason we feel the tug of contingency pulling consciousness loose from its physical moorings may be that we do not and cannot grasp the nature of the property that intelligibly links them. The brain has physical properties we cannot grasp, and variations in these correlate with changes in consciousness, but we cannot draw the veil that conceals the manner of their connection. Not grasping the nature of the connection, it strikes us as deeply contingent. We cannot make the assertion of a necessary connection intelligible to ourselves. There may be a real necessary connection, it is just that it will always strike us as curiously brute and unperspicuous. We may thus, as upholders of intrinsic contingency, be the dupes of our own cognitive blindness." Similarly, David Papineau says, "Indeed, I would say that there is a sense in which even professed philosophical physicalists, including myself, cannot fully free themselves from this intuition of distinctness. Of course, we deny dualism in our writings, and take the theoretical arguments against it to be compelling, but when we aren't concentrating, we slip back into thinking of conscious feeling as something extra to the brain." So McGinn and Papineau admit that consciousness appears to be the sort of thing which could exist independently of anything physical existing. But for some reason, McGinn at least, just assumes that there must be some unknown identity relation between the two. It seems to have escaped McGinn that the most obvious explanation for why consciousness seems distinct from anything physical is that it just is distinct from anything physical. As Charles Taliaferro points out, isn't the simplest explanation for why we feel the tug of contingency and even feel that there is a deep contingency between person and body, that the relation truly is contingent? The ground for thinking a relation is contingent is typically the conceivability, or ideally the actuality, of the relation failing to hold. We can, so I believe, strongly conceive of the person-body relation being radically altered, and, on this basis, I propose that the reason why we do not grasp the necessary tie between person and body is that it is not there. Some critics of conceivability as a guide to possibility do more than merely adopt a skeptical stance towards the principle. Some have tried to actually argue against it by putting forth examples of things which are allegedly both conceivable and also impossible. A popular example here is Goldbach's conjecture, the idea that every even number greater than 2 can be expressed as the sum of 2 primes. The objection asserts that it is conceivable either that Goldbach's conjecture is true or that it is false. But if Goldbach's conjecture is true, it is necessarily true, and if it is false, it is necessarily false. And since we can conceive of it being either true or false, it follows that we can conceive of something which is not true. Consequently, we may not conclude that something is possible just because it is conceivable. As Barry Stroud argues, it seems easy to conceive of Goldbach's conjecture being proved one day, although that is not to say that it is easy to believe that it will be proven. but I can also conceive of its being disproven, of someone's proving its negation, perhaps by finding a very large even number that is not the sum of two primes. I can conceive of a computer's coming up with one tomorrow. If I conscientiously try, then I sincerely find that I can conceive of Goldbach's conjecture being proved and its being disproved, but it is either true or false, and if true, necessarily true, and if false, necessarily false. If it is true, then in conceiving of its being disproved, I have conceived of something that is necessarily false and therefore impossible, and if it is false, then in conceiving of its being proved, I have conceived of something that is necessarily false and therefore impossible. In one case or the other, I must have conceived of something that is actually impossible, so conceivability is not an adequate test of possibility. However, we must ask what we are really conceiving of in this example. When it is asserted that we can conceive of Goldbach's conjecture being false, are we really conceiving of any particular number which is not the sum of two primes? Surely not. Instead, we are conceiving of the sort of significance such a discovery would have on the world. But that is very different than actually conceiving of the falsehood of Goldbach's conjecture. As Timothy and Lydia McGrew respond, in the two situations envisaged above, we are not really conceiving of the truth and falsehood, respectively, of the Goldbach conjecture. In fact, the situations described by Stroud are, in their clearly imaginable aspects, both conceivable and logically possible. It is both conceivable and logically possible that there should be such headlines and that mathematicians should say such things. But it is obviously fallacious to slide from these readily visualizable and conceivable phenomenon to a cognitive grasp of the Goldbach's conjecture's truth or falsehood. Nor does anything significant follow from our ability to tell a priori that the discovery of some large even number that is not the sum of two primes would falsify the conjecture. This schematic description of a potentially falsifying number cannot plausibly be advanced as a proof that we conceive the falsehood of the conjecture itself. At most, it indicates that we have enough understanding of the conjecture to be able to tell that it is logically incompatible with something else. And this falls well short of a grasp of its falsehood. And Stephen Yablo adds, conceivability in the sense relevant to possibility is a different thing from believability, and neither Goldbach's conjecture nor its negation is conceivable in the relevant sense. Another supposed counterexample to conceivability as a guide to possibility comes from the relationship of water to H2O. Supposedly, water is necessarily identical to H2O, and yet we can conceive of water as something other than H2O. So the objection concludes that we can conceive of a necessary falsehood, and consequently, conceivability cannot be a guide to possibility. As Dirk Pereboom explains, the factor that gives rise to complex mechanics in the argument is that not all conceivable scenarios are metaphysically possible. Sometimes one can conceive of a scenario only because one is deficient in reasoning. Conceiving is, then, less than ideal. Sometimes what is really being conceived is misreported or mischaracterized, as when someone reports conceiving of water that is not H2O, but is really conceiving of something that merely appears to be water, or only has the evident causal role water has in our world. Hilary Putnam makes the same objection with a bit more vigor, saying, we can perfectly well imagine having experiences that would convince us that water isn't H2O. In that sense, it is conceivable that water isn't H2O. It is conceivable, but it isn't logically possible. Conceivability is no proof of logical possibility. Popular though this objection may be, I don't think that it is successful. An initial difficulty with using water's supposed logical identity with H2O as a counterexample to conceivability as a guide to possibility is that the objection itself makes a modal claim, namely that water is necessarily H2O. But if conceivability is being rejected as our guide to modal knowledge, then how has the critic himself come into possession of this bit of modal knowledge? The critic cannot simply unproblematically assume that water is necessarily H2O. He must give us some reason to believe this, which does not make any reference to conceivability, since conceivability is the very thing which this objection is intended to undermine. As David Lund observes, our initial response to this objection might be to wonder about the grounds for the claim that water is essentially H2O. Of course, we have discovered by empirical investigation that the chemical constitution of water is H2O, but the claim that water is essentially or necessarily H2O is a modal claim whose justification must involve, at some point, an appeal to the epistemology of modality. This brings us to the second difficulty with attempting to use water's supposed identity with H2O as a counterexample to conceivability as a guide to possibility. For this objection certainly seems to be question-begging against the proponent of conceivability, inasmuch as it just takes for granted that water is necessarily H2O, despite the contrary being conceivable. But if conceivability really is a guide to possibility, then this fact simply demonstrates that water is not, in fact, necessarily H2O, as Charles Taliaferro argues. I think if you believe that you can conceive of water and not H2O, and have carefully reviewed the counter-evidence available to you, then you do possess prima facie warrant in believing there to be a distinction between the two. Presumably there could be stages in one's education when it seems unlikely that the liquidity of water is due to its microparticles, and this initial judgment would not be unwarranted. The judgment is, of course, overridden by scientific findings, but the point is that there was some warrant to override. I believe that the apparent conceivability of non-H2O water, if it is conceivable, may result from some important truths about water and aspects of the physical world. For example, it is possible, or so I believe, for us to experience many of the sights and sounds associated with water without water itself being present. There can be mirages, dreams, and hallucinations in which we may think water is present when it is not. Moreover, even when water is present, it has effects which are not identical with its substantive H2O structure. Timothy and Lydia McGrew build on this general point, saying, it may be the case that, given extant physical laws, no other underlying chemical structure would give rise to the manifest properties of water, an odorless, tasteless fluid that quenches thirst and is good for the garden. But the relationship between the structure and the manifest properties here is a matter of contingent physical law, not of logical necessity. This fact cannot be circumvented by insisting that it is of the essence of water that its structure is H2O, for the notion of essence here invoked does not carry the requisite logical weight. The statement, water is H2O, is not a matter of logical necessity. There is no particular reason to doubt that H2O supports a unique set of manifest characteristics, but even to discover this chemical fact, it was necessary to have a means of identifying water prior to chemical investigation, a description such as the clear, odorless, potable fluid that makes my plants thrive. And the means whereby we identify it there is the same as the means whereby we conceive of its existing in the absence of that underlying structure. And as a final point, I would just remind viewers that ancient people had no concept of hydrogen and oxygen molecules since science had not yet discovered these entities. Yet presumably the ancients knew what water was. But if critics of conceivability as a guide to possibility are correct that water is necessarily H2O, then this would seem to lead us to the paradoxical conclusion that ancient people didn't actually know what water was after all, and that seems to me to be a far more perplexing conclusion than that water is not logically identical to H2O. Another supposed counterexample to the idea that conceivability is a good guide to possibility comes from the planet Venus. Venus becomes visible from Earth twice each day, once in the morning and once in the evening. It is referenced as Phosphorus, or the morning star, when it is visible in the morning, and it is referenced as Hesperus, or the evening star, when it is visible in the evening. Long ago, humans thought that these were two different stars, but astronomy has since revealed that they are both the same. Obviously, it is not possible that these are two different stars, because that would mean that the object is distinct from itself. However, it is conceivable that the two are different because people believed this for a long time. So the proposition, the morning star is not the evening star, is impossible, but it is conceivable. And so the objection concludes, conceivability cannot be a good guide to possibility. As Takashi Yagasawa puts it, it appears that it is conceivable that Hesperus is not Phosphorus. Were astronomers not conceiving of some such world before the discovery of the identity of Hesperus and Phosphorus with Venus when pondering over the identity of Hesperus and Phosphorus? The answer to such questions is intuitively and overwhelmingly in the affirmative. However, in this case, we are not in fact conceiving of an object being distinct from itself. We are, rather, conceiving of being convinced that two different labels apply to two different objects. We're imagining acquiring evidence that convinces us that the morning star is distinct from the evening star. But to conceive of acquiring evidence that convinces us that they are not the same is not to conceive of this actually being true. It might just be the case that the evidence acquired is misleading. It's conceivable for a person to be persuaded of almost any proposition, but this fact doesn't pose any difficulties for the conceivability criterion because it's also possible for a person to believe almost any proposition. We can conceive of believing in impossibilities, and it's also possible to believe in impossibilities. Not only is this possible, it's actually the case that certain individuals believe in impossibilities. The bottom line is conceiving of people coming to believe something that is impossible is different than conceiving of an impossibility. Stephen Yablo makes this point well. To conceive a proposition in this sense is to imagine acquiring evidence that justifies you in believing it. Either the evidence is imagined to be disclosive of how things in the imagined situation really are, or it is imagined as, for all its persuasiveness, misleading, or whether the evidence is misleading is left unspecified. Speaking for myself, I can imagine being rationally persuaded of almost anything, provided I am allowed to imagine that the thing I am persuaded of is true, false, or of unspecified truth value as I please. To imagine a situation in which P is false, though, or one leaving P's truth value unspecified, is not a way of having it appear to me that P could have been true. So the only relevant case, the only one where I am in danger of conceiving an impossibility, is the one where I imagine myself believing P justifiably and truly. Can't I imagine truly believing that Hesperus is distinct from Phosphorus? To imagine myself truly believing that Hesperus and Phosphorus were distinct, I would have to imagine them being distinct, and that I cannot do, no more than I can imagine Venuses being distinct from Venus. Remember, though, that Hume's maxim claims evidential import only for the kind of conceivability that portrays P as possible, and the kinds mentioned do not. The appearances they convey are rather that you could have been justified in believing that P, and that you could have believed some truth or other via the thought you actually used to believe that P. What we can do is imagine believing them justifiably and believing related propositions truly. What we cannot do is imagine believing them truly. We have now examined each of the major proposed counterexamples to the conceivability criterion. There are others, to be sure, but to exhaustively explore all of them would make this video much longer than it already is. Furthermore, that task is unnecessary since the examples we have already examined are widely considered to be the strongest counterexamples. If these putative counterexamples fail for the reasons already offered, the others will fail for similar reasons. As David Chalmers concludes, in each case, the claim that there are strong necessities rests on very controversial assumptions. One might more plausibly argue in reverse. In each of these cases, the elsewhere unbroken link between conceivability and possibility provides an argument against the assumptions in question. In any case, there are no clear counterexamples to the conceivability-possibility thesis. Having answered the major objections to conceivability as a guide to possibility, I want to also say something in defense of the principle. My explanation for how conceivability yields modal knowledge is largely dependent upon my overarching theory of knowledge, which I have defended in other videos. Obviously, I cannot offer a full defense of my own theory of direct acquaintance in this video, so I will have to content myself with merely explaining how acquaintance theory serves this justifying role for me, and then let skeptics of acquaintance theory make of this account what they will. In brief, I believe that conceivability guides us to possibility by appropriately connecting our minds with the logical consistency relations among our concepts. In other words, the act of conceiving directly acquaints our minds with the logical possibility of a scenario. In this way, modal knowledge is both non-inferential and infallible. It is important to highlight that my account of conceivability as a guide to possibility requires acquaintance with distinct concepts. The aspect of distinctness is important because it is this fact which enables us to ascertain the consistency present among our concepts, and therefore the logical possibility of their being instantiated together. As Lund explains, distinctness requires a conception in which what is seen with clarity is intelligibly seen as possessing all of its whatness specifying properties, all those needed to constitute what it is to be that item. Distinctness is achieved if the clearly conceived individual or situation can be seen as self-contained without implicit incoherence or inconsistency. Thus, distinctness rules out any incoherence or inconsistency that would become manifest through an examination of the consequences of viewing what is clearly conceived as self-contained. In other words, it would rule out deep or unobvious incoherence. I have proposed an infallibilist account of modal knowledge, an account which suggests that when we are able to conceive of a scenario involving distinct concepts, we cannot be wrong about the scenario being possible. But then, how can my account explain cases of modal error? After all, don't people sometimes wrongly judge certain scenarios to be possible? And if so, then how can I claim infallibility for certain modal beliefs? It will be helpful here to distinguish between positive conceivability and negative conceivability. Negative conceiving involves imagining some parts of a scenario and merely not seeing a contradiction. A good example here is conceiving of infinite sets of things. We might imagine an infinite row of dominoes stretching endlessly into the distance, and we may not detect any logical contradiction within this scenario. However, we are not really conceiving of an infinite number of dominoes in this case because, as finite beings, we cannot really comprehend an infinite number of objects. So in this case, we are negatively conceiving of something. We have some idea of what we're talking about, and we cannot detect any logical contradictions on the surface. However, deeper investigation of the idea of infinitely many dominoes may yield a contradiction. Negative conceiving fails to satisfy the distinctness condition I set forth in my infallibilist account of modal knowledge. Positive conceivability, by contrast, involves a full understanding of the ideas being imagined within a scenario. In this case, one has not merely failed to grasp a contradiction between two concepts, one actually grasps the consistency relation which holds between two concepts by direct acquaintance. And it is in virtue of this that the knowledge is infallible. Chalmers explains the difference thusly. Negative notions of conceivability hold that S is conceivable when S is not ruled out. The central sort of negative conceivability holds that S is negatively conceivable when S is not ruled out a priori, or when there is no apparent contradiction in S. Positive notions of conceivability require that one can form some sort of positive conception of a situation in which S is the case. One can place the varieties of positive conceivability under the broad rubric of imagination. To positively conceive of a situation is to imagine, in some sense, a specific configuration of objects and properties. It is common to imagine situations in considerable detail, and this imagination is often accompanied by interpretation and reasoning. When one imagines a situation and reasons about it, the object of one's imagination is often revealed as a situation in which S is the case for some S. When this is so, we can say that the imagined situation verifies S, and that one has imagined that S. This distinction helps to explain cases of modal error. When someone wrongly believes that some proposition or hypothetical scenario is possible, it will be seen that they have only negatively conceived of the proposition's truth or of the scenario's obtaining. They will have merely failed to detect a logical contradiction, while also failing to detect a relation of logical consistency because the distinctness condition was not met. This is how my account of modal epistemology explains cases of modal error while still retaining a commitment to infallibilism. In addition to the distinction between positive and negative conceivability, we may add a further distinction between primary and secondary conceivability. Primary conceivability refers to it being conceivable that something is actually the case. For example, given all of the evidence presently available to us, it could really be true that the Celtic warrior queen Boudica never really existed, as some historians think. This could actually be the case. This scenario is conceivable in the primary sense. By contrast, secondary conceivability refers to something which hypothetically could have been the case, even if we know that it is not, in fact, actually the case. An example here would be my own non-existence. It is conceivable that I never existed, but given that I am the one conceiving of this possibility, it absolutely cannot really be true that I don't exist. Therefore, my own non-existence is only conceivable in the secondary sense. Again, Chalmers explains, we can say that S is primarily conceivable, or epistemically conceivable, when it is conceivable that S is actually the case. We can say that S is secondarily conceivable, or subjunctively conceivable, when S conceivably might have been the case. This corresponds to two different ways of thinking about hypothetical possibilities. Epistemically, as ways the world might actually be, and subjunctively, as counterfactual ways the world might have been. Secondary conceivability is more speculative than primary conceivability, and tends to be more prone to being merely negatively conceivable. This consideration also goes some way towards explaining cases of modal error because there is less information involved in secondary conceiving. As it happens, my defense of the third premise of the modal argument has employed both types of conceivability. My second argument from disassembly and my third argument from out-of-body experiences depended upon secondary conceivability. However, my first argument, and to a lesser extent my fourth argument, utilized primary conceivability. Whereas split-brain thought experiments and the possibility of out-of-body experiences are interesting hypotheticals, I never suggested that either case could ever actually obtain. Hence, the relevant sort of conceivability at play in these arguments is only secondary conceivability. But a Cartesian demon scenario, or a matrix-like scenario, could actually obtain given all the evidence available to us. Such possibilities might be actualities, and, as such, these arguments depend upon primary conceivability, which, as I have noted, is stronger than secondary conceivability, and, in my view, does not admit of cases of error. Skeptics of conceivability as a guide to possibility are quick to dish out objections to this proposed means of securing modal knowledge. They are considerably less swift to offer any sort of alternative, despite, as we have seen, helping themselves to modal knowledge whenever it is convenient to do so. If modal knowledge is attainable, conceivability appears to be the best means of securing it. And while it is difficult to directly argue for conceivability being a guide to possibility, in this section of the video, I have at least tried to give an account of how conceivability justifies belief in possibility. Furthermore, I have answered the major counterexamples which are supposed to show that conceivability is not a guide to possibility. The upshot of this section has been to show that almost everyone agrees that we do have modal knowledge, that conceivability appears to be the best account for how this is so, and that there are no good reasons to believe that conceivability is not a good guide to possibility. Lund concludes the matter rather nicely. We must acknowledge secunda facie conceivability to be an extremely reliable guide to non-actual possibility, unless we are willing to deny that any form or level of conceivability provides any epistemic access to such possibility. But the implications of such a denial would be intolerable if, as seems clear, conceivability is our only basic access to non-actual possibility. And U. Meixner adds, it is unlikely that the intuitions in favor of the premises of the first Cartesian modal argument are arbitrary, since they seem to be natural intuitions. This indicates where the burden of proof lies, not with those who accept the premises, but with those who deny them. We have now considered the truth of the third premise of the modal argument at some length. Ample reasons have been offered to support it on the grounds of conceivability. Skepticism regarding conceivability has been seen to be both unwarranted and untenable. Moreover, the specific objections to conceivability as a guide to possibility have been seen to fail. So having defended the most controversial premise of the modal argument in some detail, let us turn to consider more general objections to the modal argument. Even if none of the foregoing objections to the modal argument are promising, many skeptics of the modal argument have objected that it is circular. More specifically, they claim that one must already know that they are an immaterial mind in order to know that the third premise of the argument, that it is possible to exist disembodied, is true. For unless one already knows that they are immaterial, then they cannot possibly know this premise to be true. But if one must depend upon the assumption that they are immaterial in order to argue that they are immaterial, then the modal argument is patently question-begging. As James Van Cleve objects, no one could be sure that his thinking did not entail his being extended unless he already knew that he was not a body. If so, Descartes' argument would be epistemically circular. It would contain a premise that he would not be in a position to affirm unless he already knew that the conclusion was true. One must know whether he is extended before he can know whether his thinking entails his being extended. Likewise, Erik Olson objects, the argument asserts that it is possible for us, but not for any material thing, to survive in a disembodied state. But why suppose that we can survive in a disembodied state? If we already knew that we were at least partly immaterial, that might give us a reason to suppose that we could survive disembodied. But suppose that for all we know, we are entirely material. Then, for all we know, we can't survive disembodied. If there were material thinkers, they would have the same grounds for supposing that they could survive in a disembodied state as we have for supposing that we could, yet they would be mistaken. How can we be sure that we are not mistaken in this way? Only by ruling out the possibility of our being material ourselves. But that is what we were trying to establish in the first place. Olson's claim that there could be material thinkers who have the same grounds as we do for thinking that they could exist disembodied is, of course, question begging against the modal dualist. If the sorts of considerations we have considered in support of the third premise of the modal argument do indeed entail the possibility of our existing disembodied, then it trivially follows that a purely material thinker, if such entities are even possible, could not have these same grounds for thinking that they exist in a disembodied state. But we shall consider this and Van Cleve's more general objection that the modal argument assumes what it purports to prove more fully momentarily. Finally, Stuart Goetz, himself a committed substance dualist, similarly criticizes the modal argument along these same lines, saying, "The modal argument is valid, but it is doubtful that one can justifiably believe or know that the crucial premise is true without already justifiably believing or knowing that the conclusion is true. So the argument is epistemically circular. To understand why it is plausible to believe that knowledge of the crucial premise assumes a knowledge of the conclusion, consider the crucial premise, which entails that there is a contingent relation between my physical body and me. According to the modal dualist, my reason for believing that the crucial premise is true is that, though embodied, I can conceive that I exist without my physical body, where what I can conceive is my most reliable test for what is possible. It is plausible to suggest that if I can strongly conceive my possible disembodiment, what I grasp is the distinctness between myself and my physical body, where this grasped distinction is based in an actual awareness of the distinctness of the two entities. At this point, the burden for the modal dualist is to specify the properties he exhibits and positively grasps, properties that ground his ability to conceive his possible disembodiment strongly, but do not presuppose an awareness of being distinct from his physical body. It will not help the modal dualist avoid this standoff to say that instead of my grasping the properties involved in the contingency relation between myself and my physical body, I grasp the absence of the property of being necessarily related to my physical body. The problem with this answer is that a grasping of this absence entails a grasping of the contingency relation between my physical body and me, and this generates the problem of epistemic circularity all over again. Elsewhere, Goetz says, "If I am aware of the contingent nature of the embodiment relation, then a problem of circularity arises for the proponent of the modal argument. Although it is true that I can conceive of my disembodiment in virtue of being aware of the contingency of the embodiment relation, my being aware of this contingency requires that I be aware that I am a substance that is distinct from my physical body. In other words, awareness of my being contingently related to my physical body presupposes that I am aware that I am a soul. Thus, this awareness of myself as a soul that exists in a contingent embodiment relation with my body sustains a strong form of conceivability of disembodiment, but it does so at the price of presupposing that the soul exists, which was supposedly the conclusion of the modal argument, not its starting point." Stuart Goetz is a careful thinker, and as such, I hesitate in charging him with a basic error in reasoning. But it surely appears to be the case that Goetz is here confusing premise 3 entailing the conclusion with premise 3 assuming the conclusion. He insists that the modal dualist must be grasping something other than a distinction between the mind and the body when he conceives of himself as existing in a disembodied state in order to avoid circularity. But on the contrary, I wish to affirm that this distinction is precisely what the dualist grasps, while also denying that this renders the argument circular. The conceivability of disembodied existence is what makes the dualist aware of the distinction, and this awareness is what justifies the third premise. The rest of the argument merely draws out the entailment of the distinction which the thought experiment revealed. As Rickabaugh and Moreland point out, if the conclusion of a syllogism is to be grasped as a conclusion, it must be drawn from the experiences of each premise singularly and then together. The skeptic is free to dispute that the modal dualist is actually conceiving of disembodied existence, or grasping a distinction between the mind and body, but this is just to dispute the justification for premise 3 of the argument, which returns us to the issues we have already considered heretofore. But even if premise 3 of the argument is false or unjustified, this does not render the argument circular. As David Lund responds, a critic may charge that our modal argument is epistemically circular, claiming that I must be justified in believing that I am essentially non-physical, prior to my being justified in believing that my disembodiment is metaphysically possible. However, such a charge seems quite unjustified and rather easy to meet. It is probably true that the motivation to engage in the thought experiment has its source in the apparent difference between the mental and the physical. That there is at least a prima facie difference seems undeniable, for without it, one would have to wonder how the mind-body problem could have arisen in the first place. The thought experiment, in which I try to conceive of being in a disembodied state, is a way of exploring this apparent difference, but it does not assume at the outset what the investigation seems to reveal. More specifically, when I try to conceive of myself existing with exactly my thought properties, I acknowledge at the outset that I also have physical properties and that my thought properties are grounded in my physical nature. No assumption is made about how that grounding is to be understood. Initially, I neither affirm nor deny that I have any of these physical properties essentially, or that I am essentially a physical organism. The matter is to be decided, or at least informed, by the thought experiment. Another concern here is that if the modal argument is question-begging, then so is any other argument in contemporary philosophy which depends upon a thought experiment to motivate one of its premises. One can always just reject as question-begging any thought experiment which suggests a position contrary to one's own. But such a characterization is really terribly unfair. Thought experiments are intended to make us vividly aware of our own ideas and what follows from them, and sometimes they make us aware of consequences or implications which we had not previously recognized. Such is the intent with the thought experiments which support the modal argument for dualism. As Rickabaugh and Moreland explain, the purpose of a thought experiment expressed as a scenario is to add a deeper focused awareness to surface intuitions that we know such and such. It is not to show how we have such knowledge. That is the task of developing theories of modal knowledge. Certainly, skeptics of the argument can reject these thought experiments as inconceivable or illogical if they wish, but surely there is nothing circular about merely asking the skeptic to try to enter into these thought experiments in order to see what follows from them, if they are genuinely conceivable and therefore possible. Ironically enough, no one has made this point in defense of the modal argument better than Stuart Goetz himself. For in a more recent book, co-authored with Charles Taliaferro, Goetz makes this very point in response to the supposed circularity of the modal argument, saying, "The charge of begging the question against the modal argument might lead to a rejection of what appears to be the legitimate use of thought experiments in virtually all domains of philosophy. In philosophy today, it is standard practice to use what is called the example-counterexample method, which involves thought experiments. Imagine we are in a dispute about utilitarianism. We think that utilitarianism is an ethically valid position, whereas you think it is unjustified because it conflicts with what both of us grasp as the virtue of justice. In the example-counterexample method, we each use examples, real cases or imaginary ones, called thought experiments, in order to test and clarify our respective positions. One can object to this whole project as question-begging because, for example, if we are utilitarians, we might claim that whatever examples you use to persuade us that we are undermining the virtue of justice, they obviously beg the question. We might reply to you, if our theory leads to the conclusion that it is just for us to torture the innocent, so be it. But in practice, in ethics and other domains of philosophy, what is more common is that a good counterexample causes a philosopher to rethink his or her theory. In terms of the modal argument, then, the apparent conceivability of persons without bodies and vice versa does count as a reason for materialists to try to explain away the seemingly evident contingency of person and body. The modal argument thus provides one reason for materialists to seek to somehow overturn what appears to be possible. While I have not been able to find any definitive statement as to whether or not Goetz has officially retracted the circularity objection from the two papers cited earlier, this passage certainly appears to give strong evidence that he has. The presence of the pronoun we in the text most naturally includes both authors of the book, which obviously includes Goetz. To sum up, then, the circularity objection to the modal argument is misplaced for at least three reasons. First, it ignores the crucial role of thought experiments in the argument. These, rather than an assumption of the conclusion, are doing the heavy lifting in justifying premise 3. Second, it appears to confuse the entailment of becoming aware of a distinction between the mind and body via thought experiments with assuming the conclusion of the argument. And thirdly, it would seem to lead to a wholesale rejection of thought experiments in philosophy, since any deployment of a thought experiment could simply be rejected as question-begging. Almost all modal arguments are vulnerable to being reversed upon themselves. This is because the contrary of the possibility premise also often seems equally possible. So if possibility proves one thing, then it is just as likely to prove the opposite. As Peter van Inwagen explains, it is not always possible to invert a possibility argument, but it is always possible to replace the crucial modal premise of a possibility argument with the denial of its conclusion, and to replace its conclusion with the denial of its crucial modal premise. The resulting argument will, of course, be valid if the original argument was valid, and those who reject the conclusion of the original argument will invariably claim to find the resulting contrapositive argument at least as plausible as the original argument. The modal argument for dualism is no exception to this rule. As a result, one popular response to the modal argument for dualism attempts to effectively cancel it out by making an equivalent modal argument for physicalism. The basic thought is that just as it seems possible that the mind could exist in the absence of anything physical, it likewise seems possible that the mind should be identical to the brain and, as such, could not exist apart from it. As Dean Zimmerman puts it, it is conceivable that I be identical with my body or some part of it. This is a state of affairs I can imagine easily enough, and with as much clarity and detail as the dualist's favorite alternative. We might formulate the reverse modal argument this way. 1. My mind is essentially either material or immaterial. 2. If it is logically possible for my mind to exist apart from anything immaterial, then my mind is essentially material. 3. It is logically possible for my mind to exist apart from anything immaterial. 4. Therefore my mind is not essentially immaterial. 5. therefore my mind is essentially material. This argument is just as logically valid as the modal argument for dualism, and according to the physicalist, the third premise is equally plausible. As Van Inwagen concludes, whatever merit the crucial modal premise of your argument may have, you can't expect the philosophical world to accept it unless you can show why it is somehow better or more reasonable than the crucial modal premise of the argument for the opposite conclusion that I have presented. And I don't see how you can do that. At any rate, until you have done it, the two arguments, so to speak, cancel each other out and are, therefore, both without any force. I think that Van Inwagen is on the right track here. If the modal argument for dualism is to succeed, then there need to be better reasons for thinking that the third premise of my modal argument is true than for thinking that the third premise of this counter-argument is true. I offered 4 different lines of defense for the third premise of my modal argument, which all traded on the idea that it is conceivable that our minds could exist apart from our bodies. So the question is just this: is it equally conceivable that our minds could not exist apart from our bodies? Unlike the thought experiments which undergird the modal argument for dualism, it's not at all clear what exactly we are supposed to be conceiving of in the modal counter-argument for physicalism. The argument for dualism takes us outside of our own reality and places us in vivid imaginary scenarios, such as being imprisoned in the Matrix or as the unwitting victims of Descartes' evil demon. It asks us to imagine ourselves in sufficiently detailed, non-actual scenarios, which help us to see that our idea of ourselves can be completely detached from any physical object. By contrast, physicalists offer us nothing in the way of thought experiments which would help us see that our idea of ourselves is inextricably linked to any physical object. So then in what sense is the physicalist really claiming to conceive of himself as an essentially physical being? Charles Taliaferro puts the challenge for the proponent of the reverse modal argument this way. In the dualist modal thought experiment, I imagine existing disembodied, or switching bodies, and this involves imagining that something is present and that something is absent. I am present and my former body is not, or at least, it has ceased being my body and has become a corpse, for example. Such a state of affairs is not indeterminate between dualism and physicalism. To imagine such a state of affairs is to imagine something positive, clear, and determinate, and one which we can specify in terms that exclude the presence of my former body. The materialist's imagining his body and the falsehood of dualism is more problematic. How are we to picture the absence of a non-physical being? For the materialist to describe fully a state of affairs which is on par with the dualists, the materialist must imagine that what the dualist proposes is impossible. Is the dualist really at an advantage here? The advantage, I propose, is that the identity theorist's modal experiment is underdescribed unless it ranges over imagining a host of cases that must be judged impossible, while the dualist advances a positively described state of affairs which requires that we judge it to be possible. If we must weigh with Zimmermann which seems easier to imagine, I propose the latter. The identity theorist is saddled with a bigger task, for his imagining that he is his body must involve his imagining that the dualist views are impossible, for otherwise he is not imagining a state of affairs that excludes dualism. Taliaferro's latter remarks here highlight a further difficulty for the proponent of the reverse modal argument: the fact that modal arguments can be constructed for both the material and immaterial nature of the mind demands that one of these positions is necessarily false. One of them is actually impossible. If, as I have argued, conceivability is our guide to possibility, then the proponent of the reversed modal argument cannot content himself with merely regarding the modal premise of his argument as possible. He will need to undercut whatever grounds have been offered for thinking that the opposite premise is possible. In other words, the proponent of the reverse modal argument will need to show that the possibility of our existing disembodied is not conceivable. He must show some flaw in the aforementioned thought experiments, which otherwise indicate that our disembodied existence is possible. Otherwise, the reasons we have considered in favor of the third premise of our modal argument likewise give us reasons to reject the third premise of the reverse modal argument. David Lund puts the challenge this way: it is surely not enough to focus on one's body, or some part of it, and then assent to the proposition, I am identical to it. Of course, we are embodied, but what must be shown is that our embodiment is necessary. Since conceivability is our guide to modality, this task will require argumentation to the effect that the conceivability considerations of the sort that we have adduced are faulty. The identity theorist also must appeal to conceivability considerations in defending the modal claim that we are necessarily embodied, and this appeal cannot be effective without addressing in some detail the powerful modal intuitions we invoked in constructing the argument that our disembodiment is secunda facie conceivable. The prospects for success in this would now seem very dim. Now, one could turn around and argue that I have the same burden. I must show that the thought experiments which undergird the possibility premise of the reverse modal argument are flawed in some way. But just here we see the advantage of the modal argument for dualism. There are no thought experiments which support the possibility premise of the reverse modal argument. We have been offered the bare claim that it is possible that minds are identical to brains or bodies, or can't exist apart from them, but we have been denied any grounds for thinking that this is true. No thought experiment comparable to the ones canvassed at the beginning of this video has yet been offered on behalf of the reverse modal argument. Until that is done, the modal argument for dualism has the advantage. Physicalists rarely, if ever, dispute that we can conceive of ourselves in a disembodied state, but this concession alone raises serious difficulties for the prospects of the reverse modal argument. If the modal premise of the reverse modal argument is true, and if we can conceive of ourselves as disembodied, then this entails that a necessarily embodied person can nevertheless conceive of themselves in a disembodied state. But this implies a contradiction. If we are conceiving of a necessarily embodied being as conceiving of himself as disembodied, then we would have to be conceiving of the same being as both necessarily embodied and disembodied. But that is a straightforward contradiction, since conceivability entails possibility, and a being which, ex hypothesi, is necessarily embodied cannot possibly be disembodied. As Lund puts it, the materialist modal claim implies that I am a person who, though necessarily embodied, can conceive of himself as disembodied. But this is an implication that apparently fails the conceivability test. Contrary to this implication, we cannot conceive of a person who is necessarily embodied conceiving of himself as disembodied. For to succeed in conceiving of this person conceiving of himself disembodied, we would need to conceive of the matter as it would appear to him, that is, as it would seem from his point of view, conceiving of himself as disembodied. But this is precisely what we cannot do, for he is, by hypothesis, necessarily embodied, and we cannot conceive as disembodied a being who is necessarily embodied. Even if we can think the thought that he conceives of himself as disembodied, we cannot conceive of him conceiving of himself disembodied, for we cannot conceive of him disembodied. To summarize, then, the reverse modal argument fails for three reasons. First, it is not clear that we actually can conceive of ourselves as essentially embodied. Minimally, there have been no thought experiments proposed which would support this idea heretofore. Second, because the reverse modal argument entails the impossibility of the modal premise of our modal argument for dualism, some flaw must be shown in the reasoning which was offered in support of the modal premise of our modal argument, but that has not been done. And finally, if the proponent of the reverse modal argument concedes that disembodiment is conceivable for a being which is necessarily material, then their position implies a logical contradiction. In short, the modal argument for dualism enjoys strong advantages over the reverse modal argument, which answers Van Inwagen's challenge and thereby breaks the symmetry between the two. Perhaps the most popular objection to the modal argument, at least among philosophers, is known as the Dicto Objection. Before I explain this objection, I must give a little explanation of the difference between de re statements and dicto statements. Dicto statements employ indirect references to things, whereas de re statements employ so-called rigid designators, words which pick out one specific thing. We can illustrate the difference in the two following sentences. 1. Someone is the tallest man in the world. 2. Robert Wadlow is the tallest man in the world. The first sentence is dicto because the term someone is vague and need not refer to anyone in particular. The second sentence is de re because the term Robert Wadlow denotes a single and specific person. The second sentence utilizes a rigid designator, while the first sentence does not. The dicto objection to the modal argument for dualism suggests that something similar is going on in the modal argument. Perhaps we can indeed conceive of the possibility of someone existing in a disembodied state, and perhaps it follows from this that their disembodied existence is possible. But it doesn't follow from this that my disembodied existence is possible, nor indeed would it follow that any actual person's disembodied existence is possible. All that we have shown is that there could be a disembodied person, but that doesn't tell us whether we ourselves could be disembodied, and therefore that we are immaterial beings. The argument only establishes a dicto possibility with respect to some hypothetical person, but it does not establish a de re possibility about ourselves. As Jaegwon Kim explains, there is a problem with using epistemic, or more broadly intentional properties, to differentiate things. Consider the property of being known to the police to be the hit-and-run driver. The man who sped away in the black SUV is being known to the police to be the hit-and-run driver. The man who drove away in the black SUV is identical with my neighbor, and yet my neighbor is not known to the police to be the hit-and-run driver, or else the police would have him in custody already. In Kim's example, there is a duality of concepts with a single referent. There is the concept of the hit-and-run driver, and then there is the concept of my neighbor. Both concepts refer to the same person, even though the police do not know this. And so, the objection is that perhaps the same sort of thing is going on in the context of the modal argument. Perhaps there are two different concepts, the concept of the self and the concept of the body or brain, which both refer to the same thing, but we simply don't realize this fact. As Dirk Pereboom objects, when Descartes represents his mind as not requiring extension to be a complete existing thing, it might well be that his taking mental properties as primitive is doing the work. If he is ignorant of the inaccuracy in his taking mental properties as primitive, this ignorance will explain why it appears possible to him that his mind, an entity characterized solely by such properties, exists without being spatially extended, while this is, in fact, impossible. John Perry makes a similar objection, saying, "At the level of information flow, it is not difficult to see the difference between believing in this identity, withholding assent from it, or believing in some other identity. We can see what changes would constitute a change from the states to belief in the identity. We cannot find a real possibility for the thought that pain is not stimulated C fibers at the subject matter level, but we can find real possibilities at the reflexive levels of content that give us a grip on how the mind and the world it represents might fit together in a way that makes the thought true and explain the sort of internal coherence it has, even in the face of its necessary falsity. But just on its face, this objection appears entirely misplaced, for my version of the modal argument does not make use of de dicto statements. It explicitly makes use of de re statements. The third premise does not say that it is logically possible for someone's mind to exist apart from anything material. It specifically says that it is possible for my mind to exist apart from anything material. This is a rigid designator. Furthermore, the reasons offered in support of this premise, ranging from the primary possibility that everything we experience could, at this very moment, be a simulated reality stemming from the Matrix, to the possibility that our experiences are illusory or hallucinatory, pertain to our actual situation. These aren't possibilities for some hypothetical person. They are possibilities for us. As such, the de dicto objection appears forceless against my version of the modal argument. As David Lund responds, but the version of the modal argument that we are examining avoids such criticisms because it is of the more direct de re type, employing direct reference to an individual in making an assertion about the modal status of an individual's instantiation of a property, rather than an indirect reference by way of a diction or description whose referent varies from world to world. In the modal argument we are evaluating, I have referred to myself in a de re manner, using I as a rigid designator. It is intended to refer directly to me as subject agent, independently of dicta or descriptive phrases that may apply to me. It is the form of reference that would track what I am as subject agent from world to world, if there is anything to track. Regarding Paraboom and Perry's suggestion that we could be failing to realize that our concept of ourselves shares a referent with our concept of our body or brain, I appeal to the fact that we know the reference of these concepts directly by acquaintance, which is not subject to the sort of fallibility required for this possibility to obtain. As Rickabaugh and Moreland reply, our modal argument employs rigid designators. They involve de re beliefs and are epistemically grounded in de re knowledge by acquaintance. Kim-style counter-arguments exhibit de dicto beliefs and often non-rigid designators. So the counter-argument is importantly disanalogous to the relevant premises in our modal argument. It is clear that the problem surfaced in Kim-style arguments is based on a lack of knowledge of something relevant, and it's easy to see how one could have that lack of knowledge. But it isn't easy to see where the source of error is in our modal argument. If we do, in fact, have direct awareness of ourselves, and find it to be essentially simple, non-extended, and constituted by mental properties, and if we have a pretty good third-person set of descriptions of physical objects, including one's body, where does the error come from? We see no non-question-begging identification of modal error involved in the argument. Concepts within true propositions pick out or refer to facts within the world, and, as I've argued elsewhere, awareness of this correspondence between truth-bearer and truth-maker plays a critical role in non-inferential justification. I agree with Kim, Paraboom, and Perry that there are two different concepts of a body and mind. But what's more, I take myself to be aware of those concepts picking out or referring to facts, and I further take myself to be aware of the facts to which my mind and body concepts refer. But they do not refer to the same facts, which is how I know that there is a difference between the mind and the body. There is simply no room here for the sorts of errors which this objection requires to occur. As David Lund points out, doubts about the target object of one's conceptual fix can have grounds only if that object is not exhausted in what it seems to be. We observed earlier that if what my thought properties and my having of them are is exhausted in what they seem to be, then the conceivability data I have concerning them would be epistemically transparent. That is, the range of target items that are exhausted and what they seem to me to be includes not only the properties I am directly aware of having, but also myself as the subject having them. Given the epistemic transparency of the conceivability data I have with respect to these items, there cannot be, with respect to them, any epistemic gap between my seeming to conceive and my really conceiving, whether the item is a thought property of mine or myself as the subject having that property. So to summarize, the Dicto objection fails for two reasons. First and foremost, the modal argument which I have developed in this video employs de re beliefs rather than Dicto beliefs. And because these beliefs are known by direct acquaintance, which does not admit of errors, it is not possible that we are merely failing to realize that two distinct concepts are referring to the same thing. As a final objection to the modal argument, let us consider so-called contingent physicalism, or the idea that a material being might be able to transform into an immaterial being, or might not be essentially material. If this were possible, then the possibility of our being immaterial wouldn't tell us that we are not actually material. Few critics of the modal argument have thought that this was a good objection to it. For example, Jaegwon Kim bluntly says, if anything is a material object, being material is part of its essential nature. It cannot exist without being a material object. But there have been critics of the modal argument who have questioned this assumption. Trenton Merricks, for example, rejects this idea, saying, the a priori dualist arguments claim that if two things are identical, then they are necessarily identical, that it is possible that mental states exist, but no physical thing exists, and therefore that the mind is not identical to the brain. However, the dualist arguments need the additional premise that the body is essentially a physical thing. The premise that the body is essentially physical should be rejected because it has less support, and rejecting it requires less revision of belief. Andrew Brenner offers a similar objection, saying, I also suspect that thought experiments where we become non-physical do not automatically show that we possibly exist in circumstances in which our bodies do not exist. They may simply show that it is possible that our bodies become non-physical. Of course, if a body becomes non-physical, then it may no longer be a body, if bodies are, by definition, physical objects. But what I am proposing is that bodies may not be essentially physical, and so may not be essentially bodies. I am sure that many readers will reject this idea out of hand. They will be sure that physical objects, such as bodies, are essentially physical. But what is the source of this conviction? It's not obvious to me that physical objects are essentially physical, and I'm not aware of any serious argument for this thesis. At a first pass, and as Brenner tacitly acknowledges, a satisfactory answer to this objection seems to be that it is simply analytically true that bodies are physical objects. What else would a body be if not a physical object? If a body were to become immaterial, whatever it has become, it is just not a body anymore. Merricks and Brenner both anticipate this response, but they offer slightly different objections. Brenner's suggestion is that bodies may not, in fact, be essentially physical things after all. But then it seems that Brenner is simply operating upon a different concept of a body than I, and most other people, are employing. My conception of a body is that it is essentially physical, such that were it to become something non-physical, it would not exist, at least not as a body. Brenner seems to think that I have the burden of proof to show that bodies must always be physical things, but on the contrary, I suggest that he has the burden to explain what it is that he thinks a body is. Whatever it is, if he thinks it can become non-physical, then he is simply not using the term in the same way as proponents of the modal argument. He's just talking about something else. As David Lund puts it, the central and apparently insuperable difficulty facing compositional theorists is to provide a coherent account of what persons are and of what constitutes personal identity over time, especially throughout possible material to immaterial transformation. If I am composed of my body, yet not identical with it, then in what does my identity consist? What constitutes me at a time as well as across time? Merrick's response is similar but a bit more tricky. Unlike Brenner, he does not suggest that bodies may become non-physical things. Instead, he objects that bodies may instead simply be something over and above physical objects, which are merely contingently physical, as he explains. The objector says, 4. M is essentially a physical thing, is evident, obviously true, analytically true, such that any thinking person could see that it just must be true. After all, M is a body, and part of what it means to be a body is to be a physical thing. 4 has the epistemic standing of a claim like, all bachelors are unmarried, or perhaps 1 plus 2 equals 3. Since this is the case, no amount of argument can persuade us. The rational person must stay committed to 4, come what may. But is this line of thinking correct? Note that this objection relies on the following claim. 7. It is necessarily true that a body is a physical thing. I do not deny 7. 7 is evidently true. Part of what it means to be a body, or a brain state, is to be a physical thing. 7 can be known to be true in much the same way that all bachelors are unmarried can be known. 4, however, does not follow from 7. To see this, consider a parallel example. The President of the U.S. is a member of the executive branch of the American government, is necessarily true. Part of what it means to be the President of the U.S. is to be a member of the executive branch. It does not follow from this that Bill Clinton is essentially a member of the executive branch, for he is not essentially president. The president could have failed to be the president. Likewise, a body is a body, or a body is a physical thing, may be necessarily true. It does not follow from this that my body, M, is essentially a body. As with Brenner, it's just unclear what Merrick's might mean by a body. Seemingly, his conception of a body is radically different than that of most philosophers, and certainly of those who defend the modal argument for dualism. Again, Lund says, since the question of whether material things are essentially material is a modal question, and since conceivability is our guide to modal truth, if a material thing were not essentially material, then the possibility of it ceasing to be material without ceasing to exist is something we might expect to find conceivable. In fact, however, this seems inconceivable. One might hold that a material object can survive the replacement of all of its parts, provided that the replacement process has been sufficiently gradual, maintaining that the ship of Theseus, for example, is still in existence after all of its planks have been gradually replaced by other planks over a considerable length of time. But what could it be for this ship, or any other material thing, to exist after all its parts have been removed but not replaced? One draws a blank in trying to conceive of something that might remain. And even if something did remain, what could make it the particular ship of Theseus? Indeed, any ship, or indeed any material thing. But more fundamentally, Merrick's position, even if intelligible, seems incapable of avoiding dualism. If bodies, in Merrick's sense, are something over and above their contingent physical properties and can be identical to themselves in worlds where no physical objects exist, then we don't appear to have escaped the conclusion that there is an immaterial part of the human constitution after all. That is to say, once the entailments of Merrick's position are made clear, it seems that he has simply co-opted the concept of an immaterial soul and applied the label body to it. In other words, it looks precisely like substance dualism with different terminology. As Rickabaugh and Moreland argue, it seems unintelligible how complex objects X and Y could be identical if they share no proper constituents. How could the angel Gabriel in one world be a frog's body in another when they share no proper constituents? To clarify, a complex object is one with two or more proper constituents. A proper constituent of some object X is an entity that would be included in an ontological assay or inventory of all and only those entities that are within or enter into the being of or that make up X. Proper constituents include parts, properties, property instances, intrinsic relations, relation instances, structure, structure instances, and events or processes. For Merrick's, one's body in the actual world is a physical object, and in another world, a simple soul. There is nothing shared between a physical object and a simple soul that could ground or account for their identity. If a physical object is wholly physical constituently, then physicality is accidental to it, to one's body. But if a proper constituent, or structural arrangement of such, is accidental to an entity E, then E could exist without it. Drawing insights from other relevant cases, we conclude the object has the accidental proper constituents in the actual world, and thus, in another world, where the proper constituent is lacking, the object exists, yet lacks the accidental proper constituent. Thus, the object is what has, and is not identical to, that constituent. The same would be true of an accidental proper constituent cluster. So the object must be something over and above that cluster. It has different clusters in different worlds, and it retains identity in both worlds. The object's identity is independent of its contingent features, since it can exist without those features. Applied to one's body, if it is to retain identity in different worlds, and not merely involve counterparts, then there is more to one's body than physicality or immateriality. It cannot be a physical object or simple soul. One's body has physicality and then immateriality accidentally. But one's body must have its essential identity located in something additional to each accidental aspect in order to be the same entity in each of the relevant possible worlds to make sense of what remains the same and has one and now the other accidental proper constituent clusters. This video has developed and extensively defended the modal argument for substance dualism. It is, in my opinion, the most decisive argument for substance dualism. We saw that the most controversial premise is the third premise. I have laid out 4 lines of evidence for the truth of this premise and answered a variety of objections to them. We have considered several objections to the argument, according to which it is circular, it is reversible, it confuses different concepts, and that it fails by assuming the falsity of contingent physicalism. I have concluded that none of these objections succeed, and that Descartes is, therefore, vindicated. It is indeed possible for us to exist in a disembodied state, which entails that our embodiment is contingent, and that we are, for that reason, essentially immaterial beings. The modal argument stands unscathed.